Hello, everybody. Today is February 29th, 2020, and we're so glad you could join us for our Bible study this morning. We're recording from the Plainfield Christian Science Church Independent, Plainfield, New Jersey, the United States of America, and we welcome you all in. Today, our moderator is Thomas from New York.
Hello. So I'll start out with our quote posted for our Bible study on the website. So Job had 7 sons and 3 daughters. And he called the name of the first Jemimah, and the name of the second Keziah, and the name of the third Karen-Happuch. And in all the land were no women found so fair as the daughters of Job. And their father gave them inheritance among their brethren. After this lived Job 140 years and saw his sons and his sons' sons, even 4 generations. That's from Job 42, chapter 42. Now, from Ernest C. Moses, he writes, an incident is to be found in the closing chapter of Job, wherein the writer tells us that the patriarch, leaving 3 daughters, recognized obedience to the law of equality in that he gave them inheritance among their brethren. Looking well into the teachings of Jesus, we find that his attitude was uniform. What I say unto you, I say unto all, were his impartial words. And he illustrated his teachings in healing the sick woman as well as the sick man. Neither was denied the rights and privileges of health, holiness, and forgiveness. Not a single word or act of the Master could possibly authorize the limitation of the rights of womankind, which until recent years has clouded Christian civilization. It remained for Christian Science to unfold the truth of Jesus' teachings of impartial justice to all. This was an article called Equal Rights by Ernest C. Moses from September 22nd, 1923 in the Christian Science Sentinel.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's great, Tom. Good find.
Well, and it's very true that Mrs. Eddy was a great proponent of women's suffrage and women's rights, and was quite vocal and instrumental in bringing about reforms. I mean, she had to go to great lengths to deal with the property of the church, because initially she wasn't allowed to own property or enforce her rights. So she worked very hard to change all that.
I understand there's still people today who are uncomfortable with the fact that a woman
Established
this movement, and that still, I think she came up upon more opposition, gainsayers, than she would have if she'd been a man. But it was her spirituality that enabled her to be receptive to this truth. And I know when Tom originally came up with Titus, he was, I don't know, he talked to me maybe being a little uncomfortable with some of what Titus says about women in this chapter. But I found a commentary. It was really good. But I'll bring it out later, called Being a Titus 2 Woman. And it spiritualizes everything that's in that little chapter. I thought it was well done. And, you know, in miscellaneous writings on page 167, a Christmas sermon, Mrs. Eddy says the material question at this age on the reappearing of the infantile thought of God's man are after the manner of a mother in the flesh, though the answers pertain to the spiritual idea as in Christian Science. And one of the questions is the babe a son or a daughter? And the answer is both son and daughter, even the compound idea of all that resembles God. And she was quite consistent in talking about the fatherhood and motherhood of God, and also that each of us should represent all the qualities of God, the so-called masculine as well as the feminine, and demonstrate our completeness in that way. And these were radical views, especially at the time in which she wrote and preached.
And we should see them more clearly, and we should bring them out and live them accordingly. And be an example to mankind, because there are a lot of people that still don't see it clearly.
Yeah. And this prejudice on gender needs to dissolve entirely. Because like what was said here by Mr. Moses, if we go back to Jesus and his example and everything that we know about anything he said and did, there's nothing in there that says that one is above or beneath the other. And that's the Christ truth. Let's follow his example. He's the exemplar.
And at a time when women were not allowed in the synagogue, she taught women. She had women disciples, and she taught them. And there were writings by Mary and other women that didn't get into the Bible, right, because of the male chauvinist pigs who wrote the Bible and selected what went into it.
Yeah, I mean, Christ Jesus taught women. I think Paul did too. Always I go to the writings of Christ Jesus for clarity on all of this, though, because some of the others do go off a little bit. What were you saying about that book you were reading about the code breakers?
Oh, there's this book, and I think it's called Code Girls, and it's about women code breakers in World War II. And I was just shocked how women were treated back then. I had no idea about any of that, but they ended up being, the patient, long-suffering ones who were able to do the work, and the men weren't. And I think similarly with Christian Science, guys had, 1,866 years to be the one to get the revelation, and they didn't, so what?
So quit your bitching and
We're too busy looking down on women.
Yeah, and this is Eddie
and
had
being
it.
Competitive with one another.
Yeah.
And I always just imagine what progress would have been made if all that nonsense was not held to. And that's why I think the millennium must be. Everybody just allowed to flourish. So.
Well, and that's what a good church will do. That's what a good government will do.
Yeah, and we've made great advances. When could I bring in this about being a Titus 2 woman? Tom, do you want me to wait till later, or?
That sounds really good. Maybe, I have something to say about Phoebe. So why don't we just go through it now? Because that's how we're starting out. So I think that'd be really good.
Or something.
Yeah, Linda. Okay, go ahead. And then Thomas, you can speak too.
This was just something that I had come across because I knew Tom was thinking about this too, and it's where Mrs. Eddy writes in Miscellaneous Writings on page 210. The wisdom of God, as revealed in Christian Science, brings the serpent out of its hole, handles it, and takes away its sting. Good deeds are harmless. He who has faith in woman's special adaptability to lead on Christian Science will not be shocked when she puts her foot on the head of the serpent as it biteth at the heel. End quote.
Thank you. Thomas?
Well, I was kind of noodling on this thing about women and leadership, and so I was reading about Phoebe, who Paul calls a deacon in the church of Cenchreae, which is in Greece. It's a port city, I think. So she's very clearly called a deacon, and people really dance around as to, well, what does that mean that she's a deacon? And so they look at the word and they say, okay, well, it means minister or it can mean servant. And they say, well, obviously she must have been a servant because she couldn't be a minister, a leader of the church, you know. But you get these twisted arguments because when you look up the definition of minister, it says the minister is a servant. So, and then sometimes they come up and say, well, we think that she was wealthy and she was a benefactor, so she was called a deacon because she gave money to the church. So long arguments to say that she was called a deacon because she was waiting on people and giving money to the church, but she definitely is not a leader. Okay. So if you interpret that from reading the Bible, okay, but frankly, that's what you read in lots of commentary. Not all commentary, okay, but, you know, a fair amount of commentary about that. So, you know, to me, this is kind of the prejudice because it couldn't be more clear. Phoebe is a deacon of the church in Cenchreae. And Paul asks her to do things that are quite significant because she carried a letter for him, and you know, so I don't think we need to dance around this, you know. And there's lots of commentary out there saying that clearly Phoebe is a leader of a church, and I did read a whole write-up by the Assembly of God, which I thought was kind of interesting because I didn't know anything about the church, but it's an evangelical church, which I think of as kind of conservative. And they wrote up a whole lengthy thing about how that there's no distinction between men and women, you know? So anyway, I guess it's kind of what's saying is that there are lots of people with different views about the role of women as leaders in a church. And if you think about what I said about Phoebe and what different people have said, where some dance around that she definitely could not be a leader. She's everything but a leader. To others saying that, of course, she's a leader. And then if you go by what I read and think about Job, Job is considered to be the oldest book in the Bible. So this is not a later write-up, so to speak, okay? This is the oldest book in the Bible, and it's treating women the same as men in inheritance, okay? And then we think about the leader of our church, right? So I think we can be crystal clear about this.
Yes.
You're right. We better not dance around it. And Jesus was very clear in his instructions to his disciples, wasn't he? About who shall be greatest.
Mm-hmm.
And what role his disciples should play in life. The greatest of them will be the servant. Yes. Servant of God and the servant to mankind. There's nothing greater in life than that. So all this concept, all this talk about leadership is human garbage, right? Human interpretation. It doesn't really mean anything in God's sight.
Well, and that sort of leads into this being a Titus 2 woman. It's, in Titus, it talks about different people and what their roles are. And this is referring to the older woman. But it can refer to any woman because the older woman is training the younger ones. But to me, it gives sometimes womanhood has gotten a bad rap lately. What it is, what it's supposed to be. This kind of brings it back to biblical goals and aspirations. The first is living as a priest for God, behaving like a living sacrifice dedicated to God. I mean, we all should be doing this, but this is bringing out like a woman. Older women are to live like holy priests serving in the presence of God. Their sacred personal devotion to the Lord has so slowly come to influence every aspect of their lives. So, you think about that. Is that what you are doing? And again, there's the idea of servanthood, not trying to be the leader, but being the servant. Because by being a servant, you actually end up being the example, which ends up being a leader.
Exactly.
And then guarded tongues. This is in verse 3 of Titus 2, not slanderers. Paul turns, and of course Titus was written by the Apostle Paul. Paul turns the spotlight on the hardest member of the body to control, according to James, the tongue. And then,
of course, unless you're a man, then there are some men where there's an even harder place in the body to control.
Gary.
We're not going to.
Well, okay, we get to where James 3 is telling us that the tongue out of control indicates a life out of control, and both can cause much destruction. And slanderers, diabolos, is the very name of Satan, used of him 34 times in the New Testament. Satan has been a false accuser, and so each time he incites a behavior to do so, they are doing Satan's work. So it just talks about this idea of having a slanderous tongue or a gossipy tongue. Sometimes women seem to get that noted for gossip. And he's saying here it's at the work of the devil, that a holy woman of God doesn't slander or isn't a false accuser. And if you have that problem, here are 3 great ways to change. Think first. Before starting to say something, pause a few seconds and ask, are these words true or false, exaggerated or accurate, healing or cutting, grateful or complaining? And then number 2, talk less. It is a biblical fact that the less you talk, the wiser you appear. I thought that was plan. Well, what do they say? Well, yeah, silence is golden, I guess. Yeah. Plan, prepare, concentrate, and enrich each opportunity to speak. Make each a time to speak. And if anyone speaks, let him speak as the oracles of God. And then 3rd, start now. Like David, ask God to fit you for a word retainer. Get braces put on that tongue. Don't waste your greatest tool. So, godly women are living as priests for God with guarded tongues. And then 3rd, not given to much wine. They resist excess in any area of daily life. They are not slaves to any substance, slaves to any amusement, any fashion, or any attitude that does not please their master in heaven. Coming to Christ changes everything. It puts old habits. Sometimes they're hard to break. The old ways of their husbands would come back. It talks about how women in those days were treated so poorly. They were treated poorly by their husbands.
Mm-hmm.
And so they drank a lot.
It's not changed too much now.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's true. So it says both Timothy and Titus were told to be aware of women returning to their old habits in this realm of drinking. It's hard, when you have an old habit, when you're reminded of the pain, what started it, whether it's drinking or something else, it's easy to fall back into it. So here it's just a reminder not to, no excess. And then it says, today, not given to much, goes far beyond merely wine. There are so many forms of alcohol never imagined in biblical times that can be abused, plus drugs, both acceptable and the unacceptable kinds that can be abused. Tobacco that can be abused, wonderful varieties of food that can be abused, beautiful varieties of fashionable clothing that change with every season that can be abused, housing options, exercise options, recreational options, all that can be abused and become addictions. There's a generation of believers who have never tasted a drop of oil and pride themselves in that choice while overeating with daily regularity. And both are condemned by God. We must be as cautious of any intemperance and not be given to too much of anything, be it the use of money, the enjoyment of leisure, or the establishment of a house to live in. Whatever we do is to be tempered by the glory of God. He must be the object and focus of all we do. Therefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do to the glory of God. It's 1 Corinthians. So, godly women are spirit-controlled in every part of their life. They resist excess in any area of daily life. They are not slaves to any substance, any amusement, any fashion, or any attitude that does not please their master in heaven. Godly women living as a priest for God, guarded tongues, no excesses. And then, verse 3, teachers of good things. And so, as you live this, you are an example for all to behold, and you teach it to others. I mean, what a wonderful way for mothers to teach their daughters and for it to go on and on. And that's how it should be, examples. And this isn't being submissive to men. This is being submissive to God and his plan and what is right by him, because all of this is godly behavior. Women see every area of their lives as an open book that should and does teach Christ's gracious lordship. And then, verse 4, that they admonish. To train someone in self-control, restore to senses, admonish and exhort earnestly. God wants a godly woman whose life speaks louder than her words, a woman whose character is noticed and prompts other women to examine their own lives and seek to emulate her joy, her peace, her walk in the Spirit in evident and practical ways. The Titus 2 woman in the faith's life is a pattern for others to use in shaping their own lives. And then the final one, just rather interesting, to teach and to be an example of themselves, to love their husbands. That seems kind of an obvious thing. But again, in those days, and it still happens, where the women are so mistreated, they were very mistreated. They were treated like objects. And so they were treated like slaves to do all the work around the house, to bear the children, to have sex and all of that, while usually the husbands would go out and have other women. Solomon being a great example. And that's a pretty ugly picture, isn't it? So the women sort of just grinned and bore it, so to speak. So this interpretation of it is that you learn to love your husbands, but you you learn to be their equal, their friend, and you don't accept anything less. If you're going to be in that kind of a marriage arrangement, you don't accept being a slave girl and being put upon. You are an equal. And you see great strides being made in that today. And yet sometimes still that other exists, where the male chauvinist thinks he owns the woman. Mrs. Evans used to love to enthuse to this topic, call you a chattel. You were just the object. And that's not a godly woman. And a godly woman does not put up with that kind of arrangement. So I thought this was interesting. It says to train other women how to become their husband's best, closest, dearest, and most intimate friends. And it says, as Solomon said, who had a lot of experience, that just sexual love without romance is soon empty and meaningless, like gravel in the mouth. That was interesting. So anyway, it brings it all up to date. And to be a godly woman and being under submission to God is very different than being a chattel and being bossed around by a man, which is totally not acceptable and should not be allowed, certainly as a Christian Scientist. And I'm telling you again, Mrs. Evans would enthuse to this subject. She did not like to see. She would see women as chattels, as Christian Scientists living, and then their husbands never accepting science, usually ridiculing what they did. And it was a very toxic relationship. Toxic relationships we must not have. Relationships must always have God in the middle of them, or they're not a true relationship. Okay, so that was my Titus woman.
I have found a commentary. I have a commentary. It's called the Student's New Testament Compilation, and it comes from my grandfather, and it's very old, but it has a lot of metaphysical things about it, because it in the preference he refers to Mrs. Eddy, who talks about the importance of Christian Scientists knowing the Bible. So there's a lot of Mrs. Eddy's. He refers to her in the writings and everything in this. It's a wonderful compilation, but I don't even know if you can get it today. But in this last that you were talking about, this last verse, Titus 2:5, I found it very interesting when it says, the Greek expression translated keepers at home has a metaphysical significance in the Greek original, guardians of the home. The vicious, sour-minded Cretes demanded obedience from their wives and secured it after the brutal customs of their time. For the Christian wives to offer voluntary obedience was to secure immediate attention from the Cretans, and thus to arouse, even in their blind hearts, some interest in the doctrine producing such results. For wives of that time to have claimed their spiritual and domestic equality would have disgusted a type like the Cretans, and the larger goal of truth's infinite scope would have been frustrated. It is hard to realize the exact status of the wife of that period. Paul's counsel throughout his writings, which may seem unbalanced from a metaphysical point of view, proved to be but a concession made in the interests of the larger good, and this fact was undoubtedly recognized as such by the women who worked with him. I found that very interesting. I like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, it can be a little difficult for us today to imagine conditions 2,000 years ago. But they were obviously very different than they are today. And I couldn't help but think, as Mary was reading the requirements put on a Titus 2 woman by the writer of that, that they all apply to men too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, they're not gender specific. Everything she read
It's true.
is true, applies to men. Yeah. Be the servant of your God. If it's not right in God's sight, don't put up with it.
One of the big blockages in getting the mother church built was that one of the directors, Mr. Nixon, Mrs. Eddy said later on, just could not stand the idea that a woman was leading. So he kept arguing and blocking and coming up with all kinds of material legal issues. And then finally, when he got removed from the board, things went forward. I'm sure there were other factors, but that was one of the big ones. Then the other thing is that a journal from about 1916 that I have, I don't remember the exact year, but one time I went through a section of it counting up practitioners, and it was a ratio of about 7 to 1. Women 7 and 1 man as being practitioners, which I thought was rather fascinating.
Yeah, Mrs. Eddy had to put up with male chauvinism all the time, didn't she? And she was always putting out the call, or not always, but often put out the call to invite men to go into the practice of Christian Science.
Yeah, I'm grateful for that previous comment. And I'm sorry, I don't know the name of the person who spoke about the passage here, keepers at home. And
that was, yeah.
Because, as you said, the correct interpretation of it was to be a guardian of the right concept of home. And a guardian would not allow any wrong concept come in. So imagine a woman or anybody in a home, if there was one person that wanted to assert their priority over the other, to stand up to that and say, no, we're not going to have that. We're going to have equality based on our relationship with God. That is keeping the right home.
Thank you. Yes, it's a beautiful thought. Thank you, Karen. And I think of the story of Abigail and what she had put up with, but how she stood up to him when he was going to not take care of David the way he should have. Nabal, right? Nabal, right.
Nabal.
Yeah.
That was a tremendous story.
That was a tremendous story, yes.
Well, she took things into her own hands and took control.
Mm-hmm.
And she ended up marrying David.
And the servants obviously respected her.
They did.
Because they didn't go run tell Nabal.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Mrs. Eddy says in the chapter on marriage that mothers are the strongest educators.
She does.
Well, they are.
That's true.
Yeah.
That should.
And I always thought about that when I was raising my children. I realized that even though there may have been some other stuff going on, there are examples that I was hoping would not be exemplified by my children. I just kept knowing that the mother is the strongest educator. The mother thought, not the, and even though we, mothers and fathers, but I just had to rely on that to know that the preponderance of example and was going to be the mother thought. And I use that a lot with my children.
Thank you. One thing we would do is to see your husband in church, or you see your husband in church. If you have a husband or a wife who seems a gainsayer, opposing you, see them in church. Don't accept it. Don't accept it. Don't live with it. See them in church. And lo and behold, our church would get full of men, because it's a truth, but you have to do it and be consistent in doing it. And to see them in church, you see them as a Christian Scientist. You don't approach them as some dummy that doesn't know anything. You see the truth in them. You bring it out, and pretty soon you will see them in church. Okay, Tom.
Okay. So I think we'll move on with the questions. This has been a great discussion. I really appreciate everybody's input on this. And just to give you a quick thoughts about how I went about this, because, so much when we study the Bible, and I'll just read a couple couple of verses here from, you know where it's from. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. So that's absolutely beautiful, and we love that. But a lot of times we don't dig into these things, like the conversation we had about equality of women and what does it mean to be a leader in a church. And it's kind of important because we're an independent church. So we should have discussions about this, and so kind of have a sense about how we go about this. So Titus is what they call a pastoral letter. So there's a couple of these. There's Timothy is considered a pastoral letter, those two, and sometimes Philemon. So when they get into these different types of topics. So now Titus was a letter that Paul wrote to Titus, a person. So who is this person? That's our first question.
Well, he was a Greek, a Gentile. He went up with the apostles to the church in Jerusalem, was much conversant at Corinth, and was with Paul in Rome and Dalmatia. So he had traveled with Paul. He walked in the same spirit and in the same steps with himself, I read somewhere. So he was much admired by Paul because of his thought. He considered Titus a son, a brother, his partner, a fellow helper. So he was very close to Titus and obviously had a lot of admiration and felt that he was ready for this, to be left in Crete to finish the work that they had started and to set up the bishops. But anyway, that's what I
good.
Have.
Good sum.
Yeah.
Anyone else that hasn't spoken?
I loved what that link, the very last paragraph of the link that Thomas gave us. May we have the same zeal for the Lord that Titus showed. Every believer would do well to model Titus's commitment to truth, fervor in spreading the gospel, and enthusiastic love for the church.
Thank you.
I also read that he was acted more like Paul's secretary and interpreter. And there's a question whether he was Luke's brother or not.
Was Luke a Gentile too? I didn't think so.
Titus was like a convert from Paul's activities in the Greece area. Lit his heart on fire, and he followed Paul very closely.
I also read that Paul delegated Titus to restore order in the Corinthian church, which was one of the largest and wealthiest Christian churches, but there were many problems with divisions and moral issues. And he seemed to fulfill this with very well.
Thank you. They really didn't run from trouble, did they? They met it head on.
It's amazing all the divisions that this brings out. You know, men, women, circumcised, not circumcised. What's that other one? I don't know. There's a few more there. So they just couldn't wait. Oh, Gentile, Christian, or Jew. So.
Yeah, there are a lot of old beliefs that they had to deal with that people brought along with them. Because this whole idea of Christianity was a brand new thing. You know, it was new to the Jews. It was new to the Gentiles. And, it took the disciples a while to open up the whole teaching to Gentiles, At first it was just the Jews, and some of them got it, and a lot of them didn't get it. So then they opened it up to the Gentiles, and some of them got it. And Titus was one of the top Gentile, spiritually minded guy that fit the bill.
Jeremy brought up a really interesting point, so, and just taken from what you were just saying, is like, some people were circumcised and some weren't. Titus was not, as Jeremy said. So, and we can think of this as Jeremy was saying, was about women. So there's this whole thing about men versus women, circumcised versus uncircumcised. And are we getting overly wrapped up in human rules? Yeah.
Well, if we're getting wrapped up in human rules at all, we are getting overly wrapped up. And I think that's the whole point of all of this. Human rules may help get people from where they are, closer to where they should be, but eventually you outlive the human rules. But yes, everybody had their human concept of what the rules were, and they brought them with them and created a lot of friction until they overcame them.
As it does today.
As it does today, indeed.
I don't know if anyone said this. Titus was also sent to evangelize Dalmatia.
Dalmatia.
Yeah. Known as Yugoslavia and is now Serbia and Montenegro.
And Crete, too, he was sent.
Crete, yes. Are we ready for the next?
Yeah, I think this is fascinating. The next question. I read this. So, okay, who might be the prophet of their own? So this is what Paul wrote in Titus chapter 1, verse 12. One of themselves, even a prophet of their own, said, the Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, slow bellies.
Could that be Epimenides?
Yes, that's what they think.
Evidently, he was quite a guy. They have kind of a lot of stuff written about him, some of which, like he fell asleep in a sacred cave for 57 years and then woke up and he could prophesy. There was a lot of different things, but I think he was in Athens, and one of his prophecies, I think, saved Athens from the Spartans, but I'm not absolutely positive on that one. And he was also quoted in another section of the New Testament, I think in Romans.
Right. I think that was in Acts when Paul was in Athens. So this, yeah. Okay. Oh, okay. Well, so anyway, so here's something in Epimenides, if I said that right, said, or they think he said, they fashioned a tomb for you, holy and high one, Cretans, always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. But you are not dead. You live and abide forever. For in you we live and move and have our being. So I think we're all familiar with that last sentence, right?
Yes.
Yep.
Well, and I read that this shows sometimes God can use something to fight the source. And it said that, notice, Paul didn't say to Titus, Cretans are liars and cheats and gluttons with one of the worst reputations of any group in the Roman Empire. You should look for something easy to work with. But instead he said, I know how bad they are. Go out and see them change through the power of Christ Jesus and for his glory, which I think is wonderful. And Gary is going to read something from the Comforter, which takes this verse and applies it to today.
Yeah, this is from the Comforter, Physics to Metaphysics, Volume 3, by Yvonne Royce, where she writes about Titus. She says, the inhabitants of Crete had a bad reputation for being liars, and they were also Judaizers, responsible for some of the heretical gospel changes. So it was not an easy task for Titus. With the imminent passing of Paul, his followers must be very careful to abide strictly by the rules he had laid down. The revelation must be kept pure. The Israelites had this necessity in the Old Testament after Moses passed on. It was Paul's necessity in the New Testament. Schofield says, quote, well had it been with the churches if they had neither added to nor taken from the divine order, end quote. This is also the need in this age of the second coming of Christ, Christian Science, in the form of a textbook. Mary Baker Eddy recognized this necessity and laid down rules in her church manual, which she said were for the advancement of Christian Science. Mrs. Eddy's instructions in her manual parallel the quote from Schofield Reference Bible, quote, Amendment of Bylaws, Section 3. No new tenet or bylaw shall be adopted, nor any tenet or bylaw amended or annulled, without the written consent of Mary Baker Eddy, the author of our textbook, Science and Health, end quote. The officers of the Christian Science Mother Church, for which church the manual was written, were forbidden from adding or taking from the prescribed rules and bylaws. You know from Volume 1 that the manual was immediately submitted to human law for interpretation after Mrs. Eddy's passing. Her church, which she had rescued from the grasp of legal power and put back into the arms of love, was right after her passing put back again into the grasp of legal power. Miscellaneous Writings, page 140. There followed, 10 years later, the decision by the Supreme Court of Massachusetts to grant the church's directors absolute control over the Christian Science organization. Then, in 1971, came a ruling by the United States Senate to give them copyright ownership of Science and Health, which, in 1907, when she ceased to copyright it, Mrs. Eddy had virtually bestowed upon the world. See Brown from Genesis, page 339, that has since been rescinded and her book is no longer copyrighted.
So it's interesting to me, Thomas picked out this chapter, Titus, and how relevant it is to now and what's going on now. And that's why it's important we get a deeper understanding of it, because it's easy just to think, oh, well, this is a whole bunch of from long ago that doesn't apply. Well, it does. So thank you, Thomas.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I read something that I thought was just fascinating to me, and maybe you'll think the same thing, but this is when Paul was in Athens, and these philosophers, Epicureans and Stoics, were wondering what Paul was all talking about. They kind of talk about it. He was babbling, they were confused. And so they went to him and they asked him, it says, tell us these things well, what do they mean? And, it's kind of interesting. These people are experts in philosophy, and they know who I almost have to say this, Epimenides is. They know who he is. And Paul then explains it to him, and he quotes Epimenides. So it's just interesting to see how much Paul knew. So.
Mm-hmm. No surprise he was the right guy for that. So.
He's kind of teaching the experts of the day, right? In Athens.
Yes.
So our next question is, and I'm giving my editorial on here, but I sort of think it's important when we think about how we work together in a community and in our church. So what is a gainsayer? That's in Titus chapter 1, verse 9.
So Webster's 1828 dictionary says that a gainsayer is one who contradicts or denies what is alleged, an opposer.
Bruce?
I thought it was somebody whose head got so swollen and got so enraptured with their own self-importance that they make life difficult and miserable for everybody else, and as a result, the whole group goes nowhere.
That's a good way to put it.
That's quite an opposer.
I read in Numbers what we were directed to by Thomas, and we know what happened to the people who opposed Moses. They were swallowed up.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That was something.
Mm-hmm.
I think, too, it's someone who always has to be the devil's advocate. If someone takes a stand for right, they always have to take the opposite stand just to be, to present an opposing side from an intellectual standpoint.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
It's sort of the epitome of human pride, isn't it? Look at me.
Yeah, I always think I'm very grateful always for constructive criticism, but sometimes when it's just kind of nitpicky, and there's so much good to be grateful for, and someone will bring out some little thing that wasn't said or done just right. It's just, it's like, well, thanks a lot. Don't you have anything constructive to say? And if it is constructive criticism where something is, really needs to be done or changed, that is so important. And I am so grateful for anyone who does that. And we've had many ideas. There was some person, we don't even know who it is anymore, who recommended we have the audio of Science and Health on YouTube, which was a wonderful idea, and which we did. And the suggestion came, and that person, I don't know who he is or where he went, but we're very grateful. But nitpicking over little things is just, and it does sometimes seem to rise up as an ego, or, I noticed this, and this wasn't said just correctly, or, well, walk a mile in that person's shoes. You do it, and we'll sit around and criticize you.
And see how it feels.
How that feels. So, anyway.
Reminds me of what Theodore Roosevelt said about the man in the arena. Kind of the critics don't matter. They're the ones doing, the man in the arena is the one doing something. So.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, being a gainsayer, always finding something. Sometimes it can cause great problems. Fortunately, in our church, it usually gets squelched right away, or we don't have them at all. Thank God.
They seem to find the door on their own.
That's true. They find the door on their own. Yes, they do. Yeah. Right.
Well, pride.
Well, there's Go ahead.
Pride can't, is not welcome here, and it feels uncomfortable here, as it should.
Well, I think of a gainsayer, someone who's going to create disharmony, stir things up. Even if they think they're right, and maybe they are right. But is that how we should go about it, even if we're pretty sure it is right, by creating disharmony to be able to achieve what we think is right?
Thank you.
So we should think about how we go about things. Maybe we are right.
But it all goes
we
back.
Can do it another way,
That's right.
Exactly.
It's the right way to do everything right.
And like everything, it goes back to the motive. I like to think of, break that word down into the two words that make it up: gain and sayer. People who say things for personal gain.
Yeah.
Thinking that they're going to gain personally by saying something instead of remaining quiet.
Yeah, and in Titus chapter 1, verse 11, this is in the NIV version, not the King James, but it says here, quote, for the sake of dishonest gain.
Mm-hmm.
So,
very good. Yep.
But also I wanted to say thanks, Tom, for mentioning the idea, like, even if you have something right to go ahead with, there's a way of going about it. And what word comes to my mind is the word grace. There's a graceful way of putting forth what God has given you some kind of inspiration about. It's not a willful barging ahead. There's a graceful way of going about it. And God, through his grace, opens the way, not willfully driven.
And that is harmony.
Yes.
One of the comments about Titus was he was an insightful man who could handle problems with grace.
Yeah, that's good.
It's amazing what you can do when you get pride and ego out of the way, isn't it?
Yeah, and if your motive is truly love and loving, it's always a blessing.
And people will listen to you anyway.
Okay, so I kind of thought that we had more questions than we do in an hour. In particular, I was talking before about Psalm 23. We're kind of covering some topics that we don't talk about that often in our Bible studies. So I have another Bible study coming up, and so I'm probably going to combine that with another pastoral letter, which covers the same darn topics. Oh, I didn't mean it that way, but same topic. So if we want, so we're going to get into more about the qualities of a church leader and how to conduct ourselves by reading some of the pastoral letters. But if anybody wants to add anything, like gainsayers kind of on the negative side of things, don't do this, and the qualities of church leader, a bit more on these are the things you should do. If anybody sort of wants to throw something in here right now, that would be nice. A more upbeat, positive way of looking at things.
Well, faith which worketh by love.
One of the things I love that's been read before, Betty is writing about the Christians and leaders of during her time that inspired her. And it's in 1901, and on page 32, it says, I think about that this was probably what the early church was like. And there's a lot of wonderful things she says, but I'll read this one part. Quote, when infidels assailed them, however, the courage of their convictions was seen. They were heroes in strife. They armed quickly, aimed deadly, and spared no denunciation. Their convictions were honest, and they lived them, and the sermons their lives preached caused me to love their doctrines. Unquote.
That's very beautiful. I do love that from Mrs. Eddy, and how true. And it does. Titus does say, if you needed a strong rebuke, and maybe the Cretans did and others, he was ready to give it. So thank you very much. Well said by Mrs. Eddy.
Well, I thought this question was answered well by verses 7 through 9 in Titus 1, where it says, for a bishop must be blameless as the steward of God, not self-willed, not soon angry, not given to wine, no striker, not given to filthy lucre, but a lover of hospitality, a lover of good men, sober, just, holy, temperate, holding fast the faithful word as he hath been taught, that he may be able by sound doctrine both to exhort and to convince the gainsayers.
That's beautiful. It's a way to deal with a gainsayer.